Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It is our true pleasure to be here today on this lovely Friday morning on our last green and violet morning from UNDP's Regional Center and from UNDP's Costa Rica office. It is an honor to be here and sharing this last space with one of the true agents of change of our region, Ambassador Decima Williams. Ambassador Williams has worked as a diplomat, as a university professor, as a businesswoman, as an NGO leader, as an advocate of human rights, and a justice advocate. Personally as well, Ambassador Williams is a true mentor to many of young women, and not so young anymore like myself, who started in 2007 in the climate negotiations and were always guided by Ambassador Williams' wisdom and laughter as well. So on a personal note, Ambassador Williams, it is such an honor to have you here tonight, today in the morning, in the evening, or in the night, and for us to close our series of these webinars, of these podcasts with the voices of the Caribbean women is extremely important, and the voices of such a powerful woman as well that has recently come from COP and that can share us all of the detail is also extremely important. Ambassador William, it is a true honor, and I will pass the baton to our resident representative from the UNDP office in Costa Rica and our own gender and environment champion, Mr. Jose Vicente Troya. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, Jose Vicente, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you very much for joining us via Zoom and on the live broadcast. My name is Jose Vicente Troya Rodriguez, and it is my honor as UNDP Gender and Environment Champion of the Caribbean region and the Latin American as UNDP resident representative in Costa Rica to give you the warmest welcome to this 5th green and violet morning. The voices of the Caribbean and Latin American women who protect and transform our environment. In this, our last 2021 Green and Violet morning, we will have the pleasure of sharing with the outstanding Afro-Descendant political leader from our Caribbean and Latin American region, Ms. Decima Williams. She serves as a special advisor for implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. She brings experience as a diplomat and negotiator, a social development advocate, professor, and private sector investor. In the 90s, Decima served as Grenada's representative to the Organization of American States, deputy governor to the World Bank, and deputy permanent representative to the Inter-American Commission of Women. At the Organization of American States, she shepherded resolutions such as the Caribbean as a zone of peace, development, and independence, and promotion of small island developing states. Decima has taught at secondary, primary, college, and university levels, and is an advocate for the rights of women and girls, for farmers, and for rural development. She founded the Grenada Education and Development Program, which supports Grenada's students as emerging leaders. She has also owned a business in the tourism sector. In 2009, she returned to diplomacy as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Grenada to the United Nations, serving for over 4 years, 3 of those concurrently as chair of the Alliance of Small Island Developing States. In this capacity, she led a 40-island global climate change effort that recorded the highest ambition of keeping average global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. This was in the Copenhagen Accord of 2009, which was later included in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Her leadership secured early investment for the island renewable energy organization, CITES-DOC. Decima has participated in numerous sustainable development and political meetings, including Rio Plus 20 and the first and third United Nations conferences on small island developing states. Dear Decima, it is a great honor to have you in this fifth green and violet morning. Please, the floor is yours prior to go to the full interview. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea and Jose Vicente. It's a great pleasure to enter into this conversation with my sisters and brothers from the wider Latin American and Caribbean region. We are in the Caribbean, and so we are all one region, but we probably do not have enough encounters with you on the continent. So it's a pleasure and a privilege, real privilege to be here this morning. Thank you. Thanks very much to UNDP Costa Rica and UNDP América Latina para esta oportunidad. Bueno, I also must say that I will take half of what was said about me this morning. I will take it. And the rest, we will leave. I'm not sure exactly where to begin. I will await the start of the conversation. Back to you again, Jose Vicente. But I just wanted to say that I am impressed by the notion of green and violet mornings, because it is an opportunity to marry in a public way environmentalism with women's advocacy and women's capacity and women's passion. So whoever came up with the idea, it's a brilliant one. It reminds us of the North American initiative around bread and roses. And now we have green and violet. It's the era for that. So congratulations, and thank you for asking me to be a part of it.
Thank you so much, Decima. Yeah, the initiative is part of the whole team of the gender and environment who are working relentlessly to continue placing women at the center of the green recovery and at the center of the climate action. I will give a brief introduction to the team, and then we will start with the questions. So I'm gonna provide a brief context on this interview. As COP26 ends, the 1.5 degree goal is alive. In Glasgow, many countries, especially small emitters, stepped up, significantly raising their climate ambition while committing to bold, wide-ranging climate action. However, the picture coming out of COP26 is an imperfect one, as the world is still far short of where it needs to be to stem the impacts of climate change. The Glasgow Climate Pact reflects important steps that the world could not afford to avoid. One significant achievement is that the Paris Agreement rulebook, the long negotiated operational guidelines of the agreement, was adopted in Glasgow. There was progress on adaptation finance, the global goal on adaptation, gender, and the indigenous peoples and local communities platform. But, and now, a very important consideration, which is extremely worrisome and requires immediate action. Women of all ages, particularly those facing intersecting inequalities, are disproportionately affected by climate change and are among of those who suffer the worst effects of this climate emergency. Natural disasters, which only will increase in number and severity as the climate crisis continues, result in a lower life expectancy for women as compared to men. Women are more at risk of dying in heat waves, which are increasing. And on migration, where climate change is likely to increase, also exposes women to increased risk of gender-based violence. We have a really frightening statistics here. An estimated 60 to 90% of women are raped as they make their way through major migration routes. But women are also critical leaders at all levels of climate ambition. They have long been leaders in tackling climate crisis. They lead in building a more resilient planet for ourselves and the next generation. And Glasgow show it to us one more time that this has happened. So we need to learn much more about women's leadership in climate action. This is precisely the center of our conversation today with Ms. Decima Williams. Once again, you're very welcome, dear Decima. To start this discussion, I would like to ask you, can you tell us a little about your journey in the international relations and diplomacy fields began? What made you become interested in representing your country at that level?
Thank you, and thank you very much, Jose Vicente, and thank you for that summary of the outcome of Glasgow. We'll come back to it, no doubt. My own journey into this, will tell you is almost, it's a combination of, being the accidental person and the prepared person. Prepared in the sense that, it was a dream of my childhood, a dream of my youth to work at the international level. Don't know where and how it started out. I started in Grenada, where I grew up, and it was understanding that the world is bigger and influential in the life of my country. And so when I looked in for some of the challenges, the answers to them at home, I found that they were really in the structure of the global. And I became interested in that. I always loved to speak and I loved to serve. And then in my youth, when I was at college, which I attended at university, I became interested in decolonization and anti-colonization. And again, I realized that was something at the global level, it had to be tackled. And then, of course, I joined a political movement in my youth. I joined the New Jewel movement in Grenada, which was, a popular national liberation movement of the mid to late 70s, where ideas and aspirations would be nurtured. So I think I came up with the dream. I went into activism as a young person, and this was followed by formal education. I did get my first degree in international relations because I really thought that the United Nations in particular was an ally of people who wanted greater freedom and more development and so on. So that's how I got started in terms of preparing myself. The accidental or chance development was that I was prepared. So when the movement that I joined became the government of the country, they turned to those of us who were prepared in the field but also committed to the cause of development and transformation. So I was invited to work as a diplomat, as ambassador, and I was very happy to help the country.
Thank you so much, Decima. It's quite interesting the way in which you got involved in this diplomatic and international arena, and it's a source of inspiration for not only the Caribbean, but also the Latin American region. As an ambassador of Grenada to the United Nations, can you comment on a specific resolution or policy that you have worked in that has made an impact in the life of your country's population, particularly in the life of women and in your life and work, please?
Thank you. I spent 4.5 years at the United Nations. So there were many resolutions and many actions that were undertaken in those years. The one perhaps that might stand out is the development of the work, the program of work around the Samoa pathway. The Samoa pathway is modalities for small island developing states, and it was adopted on the Pacific island of Samoa. Now, in 2014, and I think we can see the Samoa pathways as a mini SDGs. It was the SDGs for islands, the islands of the world, who face a unique set of development challenges because of their size, small size, remoteness, the development, the fact that they are archipelagos and atolls, and they're not a single landmass, the fact that their costs of operations are higher, the fact that their resource base might be smaller, and so on. So islands are particularly vulnerable to achieving development. And of course, we know uniquely vulnerable within the context of the climate change dilemma. So there were many years spent bringing this notion of the needs and vulnerability, yet capacity of small island states, developing states, to bring that awareness to the international community, including in the United Nations. And I was very privileged, both as a Grenadian and as a chair of AOSIS, to participate in that work and to bring it to fruition in 2014. Of course, we were at the Rio Plus 20 conference in 2012. And that also was an opportunity to put before the international community resolutions and proposals for island countries that impacted on women. There are chapters in the Samoa pathway that mention and refer to the centrality of the role that women do play and can play in developing sustainably agriculture, tourism, cultural and fiscal developments, and so on. So that I think that's something that I will remember, crafting and negotiating in New York, walking through an early version of it in Rio and having it adopted in Samoa, and it continues to be under review within the United Nations. So all island countries, all women and men in the islands have an opportunity to meet the particular needs of small island developing states. So I would mention that. There are others, of course, but I think and maybe I should mention, given the fact that our region has continued to be threatened and harassed by hurricanes, various resolutions and various sessions to bring that constantly to the fore. It's important. And I should mention also the work that we were able to do in my mission as a whole team, because you work in a team, it's not an individual, you work in your delegation, in alliance with CARICOM, in alliance with GULAC, and so on. The work we were able to do to get the nomination and subsequent election of Christiana Figueres as the executive secretary of the UNFCCC. That's diplomacy in action. That's hard political work to get a Latin American, get a woman, her background was in NGO work as well. And so I think she has been a beacon, an exemplar, and a great advocate of women's rights and women and environment. So I was able to participate in that diplomacy with my team, with the team from the Caribbean, while I was at the United Nations.
Thank you so much, Decima. You already answered part of the next question. What's the importance of diplomacy, international agreements, and policy instruments to address issues such as the environmental degradation and gender inequality? In your experience, what are certain strategies that can work to implement a transition from policy to action?
Yes. Diplomacy is a process, it's an engagement, at least how I've experienced it. It's not always easy, but it's a challenge, because at least at the multilateral level, the United Nations, where there are so many countries with so many needs and interests, to negotiate with that great diversity and come out with something that is agreeable to all. It's a challenge, but the important thing is to seek consensus, to find a way to gain a common ground. There are going to be differences, but to expand the common ground to cover as much as possible for every participant, that to me is part of the main success of diplomacy doing, and to avoid, minimize, reduce, even eliminate conflict, and to strive for cooperation, solidarity, and therefore I think the search for consensus is the biggest challenge, even within your own grouping. The question, for example, of climate negotiation, climate change negotiation. Just to give you an example, we have at least one oil-producing country within CARICOM, and yet we have to come to an agreement about the role of fossil fuels in the climate negotiations and in the outcomes and in the emissions reductions and so on. So it's, even within our own group, we have to do diplomacy. But I think we have been largely successful. We need to be more successful in this period, but the key here, I think, is the power of the norm, the power of the agreement. Once we can set standards, we can set parameters, we can agree on a course of action. That's where the power is. That's the real power, and the value of diplomacy. And I want to mention here the critical role that women can play, and women do play, because by and large, women are consensus builders, and prefer cooperation and to work things out, to work through things so that we could agree and have a more harmonious than a conflictual set of outcomes and relationships. And so I think women bring that value and bring that experience in many cases to the diplomatic table. We see in our region the Escazú Agreement, and that's something very powerful around the right to information, the right to participation in environmental matters. And I believe that women have been uniquely involved in crafting it and in applying it. And in fact, we know that women in our region have been killed as environmental activists. And that's shameful for the governments that do not allow women's voices and women's leadership to rise to the fore at a moment when we are having such challenges and such threats from environmental destructive outcomes of the period. So yes, I believe in the power of diplomacy, and I think women's roles in it can be critical. In the United Nations, for example, we have a very, very small number of women, I think 30 out of 194 and things like that. But women serve as mentors to younger diplomats coming up through the pipeline. And women's leadership in the Security Council, for example, is very valued and very, very important. We do now have the ambassador of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Ambassador Rhonda King, who has been in the Security Council for the last 2 years almost. And she brings, of course, the policies of her government, but I think as a woman, she brings a unique contribution of the search for peace by the United Nations at the global level.
Thank you so much, Decima. Your words are really inspiring, really wise, and extremely powerful in terms of supporting, expanding the voices of women in not only the Caribbean and Latin American region, but also in the entire world. Speaking on the entire world, every day we live in a more globalized and connected society. And in many ways, this has enhanced the way we cooperate for common causes for public goods, such as women's rights. Nevertheless, globalization also can have negative consequences. In your perspective, what are the barriers society and the international community face in this context?
If I understand you, I would reply that the international community's lack of democracy in its structure and its operations constitute a barrier to globalization. I'll tell you why I say that. Globalization has meant that goods and services and culture and people are more available to each other than before. But it is the case that there is so much inequality. Inequality has arisen and expanded at the same time that globalization has expanded access and resources to the world. And that inequality, to my mind, is because of the unequal relations and the structure of inequality of governments, of nations, of systems within institutions. I can mention particularly the Bretton Woods institution, the voting rights have not been equal, have not shifted from the time of Bretton Woods in the 40s to the time of globalization in the 90s and beyond. It's the same arrangements of how the voting power is distributed. The same for, let's say, the United Nations, the Security Council. Security Council has remained the same power quotient has been distributed. After Africa, for example, 50 countries have become a real force in the world, or the Caribbean, or Asia and the Pacific. So I think the structure of decision making that is still unequal, and access to resources, the power of corporations in the international economy, all of that has suffocated and stifled the benefits of globalization, getting more even distribution and being an asset for the achievement of sustainable development. Now, I notice, well, not I notice, but we all know now, for example, that the World Trade Organization is led by an African woman, and some other organizations as well. So women are percolating close to the top and at the top of governments and of global institutions. And that is welcome, but there have to be sensitization and a program of democratization along with that. So a critical feminist analysis of trade, feminist analysis of global economics, feminist analysis of investments and the green recovery, those remain important, so we don't just have what I call add women and stir, which is you bring in women at the top or somewhere close to the pinnacle of decision making, and it just has a different face. It's just a women's touch, but the transformative value of women bringing the agenda of change, that's what we really need. And when we have that, we will have a globalization that serves the humanity. Right now, I fall on the words of Garcia Marquez, our Latin American writer, who said in the late 1990s, he says that the most important thing we need now is women's leadership at the global level. And he went so far, his words, and some of us have taken it to heart, that in the main, male leadership have squandered the heritage of the 20th century. You know, male leadership that came out of the end of the war and wanted to reconstruct the world in a particular way. We have to change that. Too much militarization, for example, too much exclusion, too much abuse of the environment, too much use of child labor and so on. So that we need a globalization that is focused on achieving good for all of the peoples of the world, for ending poverty. And we know that poverty still has a face of women and children. So I think the structure of power is what will democratize globalization so that it serves people.
Thank you so much. Now switching to the exceptionality the small island developing states face. I would like to ask you, what are the key challenges the seeds are facing in terms of environmental degradation, climate emergency, and gender inequality?
Yes, it's a powerful combination, isn't it? I can speak from my experience as an island person, where the informal economy is populated by women, and that informal economy, by and large, depends on the environment more than not. So women are into making handicraft and specialty foods and so on. Men are there also. They are creating fuel from burning wood and selling, products from the forest, animals from the forest and crabs and so from the ocean. So the destruction of the environment affects the livelihoods of the ordinary people and of the poor people. And therefore, we need to ensure that the environment is intact as a resource to the country, you know, to help us get clean air, clean oxygen, products, and at the same time to provide livelihoods in a sustainable way for people, small farmers and informal workers. The destruction, for example, of water that we are now seeing, you know, the drying up of the rivers, the destruction of lakes and farmland, that is having a major impact on the livelihood of the poor and the vulnerable, whom I already said are predominantly rural women, poor women, people on the economic margins. And therefore, there is a need to rethink our development model so that it is inclusive both of those who are not in the formal sector, as well as the preservation of the environment. I'll give you two examples. In the extraction industry, that destroys habitat, that destroys the opportunity for people to continue to farm when oil is taken out from the land, for example. But the more immediate one is in tourism, because many of our islands are involved in tourism. And the tourism model we have right now is these large conglomerates are coming to find pristine areas, many of it on the beachfront, in wetlands, and they are destroying the environment, destroying the beachfront, taking ownership, pushing aside people who make their living there. And some of our governments are not finding it easy to create alternatives or to manage the land use or the destruction of the habitat of the birds and so on, because of the development model of large scale, hotels. In the past, many of the smaller islands had small scale development in tourism that was more sustainable. The ownership was more broad-based and indigenous, and the food was sourced, from a large number of smaller farmers, less imports, more authentic, organic, and original supply to the tourism sector. And while we want to scale up, we must scale up to meet the needs of the expanding population and the desires of the public for a higher standard of living. We've got to be a little bit more sensitive in the way that we pursue the relationship between the environment and the people, especially those who are outside, and investment. And I think that has to be redesigned away from the traditional model of tourism in particular. As I said, in the extractive industry, with which I'm not familiar, I know some of the Caribbean countries are moving forward, and we are afraid of what might happen with, destruct oil spills in the rivers or on the coastline. That can have very detrimental impact on livelihoods as well as on the environment. So I would say that the development model is really has to be brought under the microscope here, and the authority with which natural resources are sold or commissioned out for large-scale development. That's a problem. We've got many sites on many islands that are being harmed by this kind of development that is not done in conjunction with the local population. And women are not the only ones here, but they are on the front line. Again, we have the Escazú agreement that governments should apply. And I think that would bring a modicum of balance.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is really important the way in which you frame the need to establish a new relationship between nature, humankind, and investments. That's in order to tackle with all the development issues we need to face and to address, to progress to a green and a violent recovery from the COVID-19. Staying again in the area of development, what encouraged you to start the Grenada Education and Development Program, GreenEd? Tell us about GreenEd, this wonderful experience, please.
Thank you. Yes, it has been a wonderful journey of 25 years. Again, it's the efforts of many of us who agreed that the right to education is a basic human right that all children should attain. It was the late 20th century, 1996, we started this organization. And the point of it was to make sure that rural children in particular, and all girls and boys, have access to secondary school education. Late 20th century, secondary school education. That you could not be pursuing sustainable development without having a fully educated and engaged population, and boys and girls and boys. So the idea was to make sure that they were skilled, and part of you ask what inspired, part of the inspiration came from what I just said, that the development of the country was really in the hands of persons who are coming from outside, and some of the sensitivities were not taken on board. Rural people, and remember, this is a country where people came out of slavery in Grenada. And so there are many lingering issues. Rural had less resources, and you say, okay, small countries, what's the difference between urban and rural? We still had some. How people spoke, what people valued, what did they eat? All of those things differed if you had access to the metropolitan influences and if you didn't. And so having, formal education for a rural girl, especially a dark-skinned rural girl who's coming from, a culture of the land, that was important. If the family and the girl herself were to move forward to get employment in the state sector, in the private sector, to be able to hold her own as a leader in the country. And so I felt that was the time had come where that possibility should be routinized. And therefore, if girls and boys in the rural sector could access and succeed at education, rather than becoming pregnant or becoming bored or dropping out of school, that was a contribution to the sustainable development of the country. And we've been able to do it for 25 years, to provide financing, to pay for tuition or fees or transportation or uniforms or books. And sometimes we were able to give, a computer. And it was important for that to happen. And I have to confess that it hasn't happened at scale, and the negative side, but because we've only graduated maybe about 400 or 500, right? And they've gone on, however, to do wonderful things. We have diplomats, I'm proud to say. We have physicians out of that group of rural people. We have teachers, we have police, we have farmers, we have people, who've gone on to transform their lives and to achieve at a higher level, to work as a higher level than their parents. And so it's education, is really, apart from health, I think is the second most important contributing factor to the sustainability of an individual, and therefore a household, a community, and a nation. And for girls and women, their education becomes a pivot for child raising in a continually sustainable manner. So that's what we've done. And so maybe I'll take the opportunity to say GrenEd, the Grenada Education and Development Program, continues to need your support. You can support us in 3 ways. Sorry to take this little commercial, but you can support us by telling others about our work and what we do, by volunteering yourself to teach, to give us webinars or to come and spend time with the students, and of course to support our young people.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing this. And of course, I think that all the audience is more than
more violets. We want more violets to come up.
Yeah. Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing this, again, inspirational and transformative.
Violets.
Yes. So please, we will gonna share. Can you please share in the chat the Grenade Education and Development Program? It's really inspiring, and I fully understand that it needs to be supported. Thank you so much. Now, returning a little bit to the UNFCCC. Considering that the Gender Action Plan is currently in implementation, what do you consider, looking forward, what are the necessary elements on behalf of decision makers to make sure that the established goals and results of this Gender Action Plan of the UNFCCC are fulfilled, are reached?
Thank you. Participation, women's participation, yes. Recognition of the capacities of women. Of course, we recognize the vulnerability. We know that, more women drowned in floods and so than men because they can't swim. We are not taught as island girls or as, women across the continent to swim in as large numbers, particularly poorer women. In the middle class and the elites, everybody gets swimming lessons. In the poorer households, it's not the case. So we need to have more, we recognize the unique vulnerability. Women don't own as many cars, although now I see in Grenada, a lot of the young professional women are owning and driving cars so they can get away. They have more independence. And many ways in which women's lives, they don't have as large as a savings account. Let me acknowledge here that the status of women in the region is improving. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Through education, through earnings, and through holding public positions. Women, I remember, I'll tell you a tale in 1995, when I raised this matter among all the political candidates running for office in Grenada. One of the respondents, there were 5 men running for office for prime minister in the respective parties. One of them said to me, "How could you be advocating for women when look at you yourself, you're here?" In other words, the few of us who had education and who had an opportunity, that was supposed to be sufficient. That's not sufficient. We are 50% of the population, 50-51. We want what is entitled to every citizen. So the notion that we are vulnerable, it's there. We are rising, it is there, but we are not yet, and our values and our perspectives are not being taken on board sufficiently to make that inflection, that critical transformation whether it's in the green recovery or in the ongoing sustainable development of our countries. And so for the Gender Action Plan to succeed, it means that we must recognize the unique status of women, including exclusion and inadequate representation. We must recognize that the skills and talents of women are not sufficiently developed for their own personal and family development and that of society. And we must recognize that including women in decision-making at all levels, especially around policies for the climate response, whether it's on climate finance, what is adequate, where should it be directed, whether it is mitigation levels, what constitutes the safe zones or the viable economy, viable practices in the economy. Women have something to say and should be actively engaged in the domestic policies at the negotiating tables, and particularly around the distribution of resources, including climate finance. So women are playing a role in adaptation because they are in NGOs and they are in the service sector. So they are getting a chance to implement what is passed, what is agreed to. But we think that there needs to be more engagement, because we bring the sense of urgency, because we see the human need more immediately and directly. And I think the changes that are happening are very welcome, to the extent that we have many men are understanding the dimension, the value and the power of the dimension of women's input. For example, women bring greater peace, and I want to commend UNDP and the Spotlight Initiative, and the European Union for the Spotlight Initiative, which is to end violence against women. Because as we reduce the violence against women, it frees up their capacity for living and serving. And I think many men are valuing that, valuing women who are healthy and thoughtful and engaging. And that is really where we want to pitch the society of the future, the society of the 21st century. So Gender Action Plan cannot be separated out from sustainable development and from the green recovery. Women have to be at the center of decisions, particularly as it relates to the environmental impacts on households, whether it's food security or clean water or good health. Women are at the forefront in providing these services in the home, in the community, and need to be at the center of searching for the appropriate kinds of responses to recover the economy and to grow it as well.
Thank you, Decima. Which do you consider are the key drivers in terms of accelerating the achievement of the Agenda 2030?
Well, attention to climate change is number one. If we exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's destruction and chaos. So one of the main drivers for sustainability and Agenda 2030 is climate change. Another one has to be awareness and education, particularly education and awareness of climate and the need to make sure we reduce emissions and get away from the tipping point. And I think there's a bit of that happening in the Caribbean. Most people are sensitive in Latin America and the Caribbean. Most women are engaged, you know, because we see what's happening, for example, with water or with food or with hurricanes or, you know, so there is an appreciation for, you know, gaining greater knowledge. Another driver for achieving Agenda 2030 has to be appropriate investments, investment in sustainability. You know, there has to be more in health, in education, in wellness, in expanding the economy, in making sure that youth and women are employed in numbers that are commensurate to their presence in the population. We have so many young people who are unemployed that they can migrate or they can, you know, they need to contribute to the economy. So I think in this regard, perhaps debt forgiveness is another driver. The heavy indebtedness of countries mean that they cannot adequately invest because in the society, because so much is, you know, 60 cents per dollar, 55 cents per dollar is spent in debt repayment. Well, it makes it very difficult. So I would say a fourth one would be more research as to what exactly would work, you know, research and documentation. We might have ideas about what to do for the economy, but should the balance be in fisheries or in agriculture or in tourism or in entertainment sector or in culture, in fashion? Where should the new green dollars go? And I think involving people in, you know, in a democratic exercise around the economy, around the future, is really a way to drive towards the success for Agenda 2030. We can't just continue to make fiscal and developmental decisions within the state bureaucracy. These have to become public conversations among NGOs and organizations of the private sector. We have to teach the SDGs in colleges and universities so creative minds could come up with research. You know, our cities are expanding. How do we accommodate that? What are the goods and services that are needed in what quantity? Well, those are good research projects that if people know that it's imminent, it's tied to a goal that's only a decade away, I think a lot of young scholars will put their minds to creating architecture or services or other relationships that could be useful for, you know, reducing slums and reducing, you know, disorganized increases in our cities. So I think, in summary, I would say that research and involvement, popular research, not just in the academy, but coming out to people through awareness campaigns. I would say, I forgot my four, but I've laid them out already. Investments that are people-centered. You know, many people have great ideas and solutions, but we are not taken seriously because it's not coming from abroad. And I think indigenous knowledge, particularly in relation to health, to medicines, to how to manage our forest resources. We've got we've got, people who've seen what their grandparents did. And I'm not hopping back in a romantic way to the past. I'm saying that we can, in fact, combine modern scientific knowledge with the knowledge that is there in the society and has been there as a solution for a long time. So we ought not to just think that everything modern cancels out everything from the past. And the Agenda 2030 calls on that. It's an intergenerational strategy for saving ourselves as people, saving our planet, and moving towards prosperity. And I want to put a plug in here for the oceans, for the seas, which is 2/3 of our planet. I know in case of many of the Caribbean islands, our ocean space is 75 times our land mass. So we've got a lot of resources and assets out there in the ocean. And we have to be sensitive to its sustainable development. It's not just for oil drilling. It's really a source of income, let's say, from tourism. It's a source of income for fisheries and livelihoods generally, and many ways. So we can be very engaged using all of our university scholars, and so in how the ocean, the ocean can feed us in a more sustainable way and reduce our food import bill, which then reduces, our debt and our external spending, and brings us closer to the goals of the 2030.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Decima, for including an additional color to our strategy. So we are going to work now for the green, violet, and blue recovery. And we will have to factor in much more what the ocean brings us in terms of rich wealth, but mainly in terms of providing us several ecosystem services that are helping to protect the terrestrial ecosystems. Thank you so much for this very, very, very rich conversation. Your words have been inspiring, powerful, are a way to expand and to inspire new words from the women voices. And from UNDP, we really like to thank you. And I'm going to close now saying that at UNDP, we have created these green and violet mornings that highlight the voices of women leaders who are agents of change and who lead pioneering efforts in addressing various environmental issues and promoting gender equality and the empowerment of women in all their diversity throughout the ecosystem's protection and climate action. Today, we close with this wonderful participation of Ms. Decima Williams. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next year with more green and violet mornings. Have a great day. Thank you so much, Decima.